name's William Campbell, Bill Campbell. I was born in Columbus, Ohio, but I'm from Bristol. I was raised here all my life, and just went away for about 10 years to Texas. Spent some time there. Went to University of Tennessee, and but the rest of the time I've been here in Bristol. No, I was born in Columbus by accident. I wasn't supposed to be born in Columbus, but my mother just happened to be there when I was born, and but she was from here. Well, my my mother's the one that I really had got me into my finding out about my family history, and I've been checking her family records all the way back to slavery, and that's what really got me involved with a lot of family history and the Citizen Cemetery, and trying to find out how many of my people were buried up there. I've got some great uncles and aunts, great uncle and great aunts up there. It's on the far end of Piedmont Avenue on the Virginia side of town. Yes, she wanted me to talk about it because, like I said, when I was, my mother passed away in '99, and I just got interested in my family history because I realized I really didn't have any local family, and I knew I had a big family, cousins and stuff everywhere, but I didn't know anything about them. So I started checking into my family history, and I wanted to know who was buried up in Citizens because I knew I had people up there. And at that time, it was overgrown. You couldn't see any headstones or anything. And so we didn't really have find a grave apps and stuff like that to look up who was buried where. So I just started going to the Washington County courthouse and talking to a lot of elderly black people, finding out who might be up there. And that's how I got involved, excuse me, in doing that. And talked to P.H. Robinson. He was basically a local historian. He didn't think of himself as a historian, but he was a funeral director, and he knew everything about the black community here. So I talked to him quite a bit. I talked to the local historian, Bud Phillips, who's a Bristol historian. He knew quite a bit about the black history here. And like I said, I talked to a lot of elderly black people. And once I got to digging into the Citizen Cemetery, and I wanted to know exactly who was buried up there. So I start taking Saturdays and take a whole day Saturday and just start digging up some of the old monuments that were there, because I knew they were there, we just didn't know where they were. And so I would take weekends off and just dig up monuments, and they would be sometimes 1.5 feet down in the ground. And I think I ended up finding like over 100 monuments in the ground. And at that time, the Sutherland's Academy had decided they would come over there, and sometimes and they'd see me over there, and they were considering renovating the whole Citizen Cemetery. They wanted it as a project to clean up, so they started coming over there, and they eventually cleaned it up along with there's a Citizens Association headed by Michael Carter. They were heavily involved in it, and so they cleared it up quite a bit and put a whole new landscape up there, cleaned up all the monuments. A lot of monuments were toppled over. They fixed the monuments, but the only bad thing about it, they put a whole layer of new sod on the whole. It's about 6.5 acres, on the whole 6.5 acres, and in the process, they covered up almost all the monuments we dug up. so it's now we still got monuments that are in the ground up there, and a little ticked off, but still we made a map so you can kind of figure where a lot of the people are buried up there, and we ended up making a booklet about all the people buried there, and I'm in the process of updating it because we've found quite a few. And then I talked to, like I said, P.H. Robinson, and he said he had buried a lot of people up there, and he said he knew for a fact that there were people on top of people because they really didn't keep accurate records of what was going on. But in going back a little bit of the history of Citizens, it was originally in an area called Flat Hollow, and I got a lot of this information from Bud Phillips, and it was a old slave cemetery that started around the 1830s, and they just start burying slaves from the Susong and King families. They had King family had a mansion in the area, and they owned a lot of acreage on the Virginia side, and they started burying their slaves there. But after the Civil War, black people were continued to be buried there. And I'm just assuming, I never did hear anything officially, I just assumed that the Kings owned so much property, they just said, well, we just don't mind you keep burying people here because the black people didn't own the property, but they kept burying the people there. So there was a Citizens Cemetery group that came together. They had a bunch of trustees, and they oversaw everybody that was buried there. And so there were black people in Virginia and Tennessee side buried there. It still didn't have a name. It was the Flat Hollow Cemetery, or sometimes called the Colored Cemetery. And they continued to bury people there. And around 1891, the King family decided to sell the property because it was becoming a little populated in the area, and they thought they wanted to sell it. And the Bristol Land Company, they were interested in building on that property, but they knew they couldn't build on top of the cemeteries. So they decided, well, we'll exchange properties. When they bought the property, they brought a whole tract of land from downtown area now on back to the Piedmont area, Piedmont Avenue. And they decided, well, we'll see if the black people will let us move all these graves over to Piedmont, and we'll purchase this land and then sell them that land up there. And they decided they would do it. So in 1891, the land was purchased, but it wasn't officially sold to the trustee committee, and can't remember the name of the trustee committee, but they were the Citizens Cemetery Trustee Committee, and they were affiliated with the trustees of the John Wesley Methodist Church back then. So in 1904, I've got the deed from Washington County. They officially bought the property up on where it is now, Piedmont, about 6.5 acres on Piedmont, and they started moving all the graves up there, and this took quite a while. We don't know exactly how long it took, but it took quite a while, and they brought people from other cemeteries also. And then, by the way, there were some white people up there too. There was because it was kind of used as a pauper cemetery also, so quite a few poor white people were buried there, and along with black people. And so I don't know when it was officially named Citizen Cemetery, but it was still called the Colored Virginia Cemetery, the Colored Cemetery. And I know I started seeing records like 1915 where it was showing up as Citizen Cemetery. And if anybody's watching this, if anybody's checking old records and things, if you have people from Bristol, be very careful in this time period, because there's a second Citizen Cemetery on the Tennessee side on Weaver Pike, and it was established in 1900. And it's now called Citizen Cemetery, but in the old days it was called Bideman Cemetery, the Colored Tennessee Cemetery, and the Colored Weaver Pike Cemetery. But it was also renamed Citizen Cemetery, and don't know exactly when. So there are some records that I looked up. I have no idea where the people are buried, because they say they were buried in Bristol at Citizens, and I don't know Tennessee or Virginia, so we really couldn't establish. So sometimes when I made the records out, I would put in our records that these people are shown as being buried as citizens, but we're not sure if they're on this citizens or the other citizens, so you might want to check if you're a family member. But there were, I think the last person buried up there is still a functioning cemetery. The last person buried was 2005, and the first, well, not the first person, but the oldest stone up there is from 1867, I believe. And there were people, like I said, there were quite a few well-known black people of this area at the time. It was the first black lawyers up there. There's several doctors, medical doctors. Bristol did have a doctor, at least one, all the time. And so some of them are buried up there. And I've noticed recently, I think about a year ago, they were the records were put into Find a Grave, which is online, and you can get online and search Find a Grave and find some of the people up there. But I'd be very careful about that, because sometimes I've noticed Find a Grave can be kind of tricky, and it may not be correct. So just if you're looking up your family member, just be careful that you find the right person in the right place. There's Whitten, Pace. There are quite a few Paces up there. The Fraction, um, Burley, Taylor. Oh yeah, the Heaths and the Savages, and the Dykes, and quite a few Johnsons, and forgot about the Browns, the Cowans, and and like I said, there were some that were, the Hortons and the Speeds and the Tabors, and there are quite a few Hatchers up there also. And there were I noticed in records there were several people that I guess maybe were traveling through Bristol or something, and they just died here and they were buried up there, and they said they were from somewhere else. And it's amazing how accurate some of the records can be to look up, and because the person doesn't have any kin people here, but they're actually buried up there in citizens. Well, the Citizens Cemetery Committee maintains it right now, and they're always having fundraisers too, and they have a problem trying to raise money to keep it cleaned off, because it's pretty expensive to keep the grass cut and the weeds out of it, and trees trimmed. And they've been doing a really good job. Like I said, it's headed by Michael Carter, and he's been doing a great job just raising money and trying to keep people interested in it. And but if people could donate to the committee or track down Michael and just give money to it, because it's going to a good cause. Because it was in ridiculous shape. You could not even walk through there when it was overgrown. Well, I've got two. Let's see, I've got an uncle and an aunt. My mother's aunt, so my mother aunt and her husband, and she's got that's right, she's got two aunts up there, and both of their husbands are buried there. And I do have some distant cousins up there. I don't know exactly where they're buried. I know they're there, but I don't know where. And I forgot, there's a family called the Morrisons, and it was a large family up there, and they're on the very top of the hill, but they have no stones. And I knew James Morrison pretty well, and I would ask him, why don't you guys have stones up there? Because their family goes back decades, and nobody ever put a stone up there. They could afford it, but were never understood. And that's the problem. There's so many families that there's no stones up there, and you don't know where they're buried. So you just know they're there. You can just kind of go up there and deal with the problem, but you just don't know where most of the people are. I didn't realize there's so many people. I guess because of the war, World War II, I didn't realize so many people served in the military. My relatives, because nobody ever talked about it. So yeah, there were so many people. Just about everybody served in World War II back then, and would come home and you'd never hear anything else about it. And then you start. I talked to one of my cousins who passed away, and he had been overseas. He had served in Africa, Walter Baker Sr., and he had never talked about the war at all. And I just talked to him for a little while about it, and he just like it was nonchalant. You know, we were in battle in North Africa. He served in North Africa, and that's the way they were. They were just humble and just came home and went about their business. But yeah, that's the main thing. It's just so many military people. No, I've got one that's in the Arlington National. Got two in Arlington National Cemetery, and I know of at least three that are in. One is in VA in Johnson City, and a couple of others are in. One's in the National Cemetery in New York, and one's in Pennsylvania. But the other ones are just buried in regular cemeteries that have, most of them have military stones. There were quite a few when we were up there working on the cemetery. There were quite a few caskets that were coming up out of the ground. So there would be an edge of a casket that would be there, just coming up out of the ground, and we didn't realize how bad it was, and we came across snakes up there and everything, but yeah, that they would just rise up out of the ground and just like sit there on the side, and not really, no, no. No, it just, but after years, we came across two or three that were, you could just see the corner of the casket that was there. Uh, and let's see, anything else of interest that happened up there? Um, no, I just noticed when you're looking at cause of death of people, back they had names, old names for things that happened to people, and you just realize that there were so many babies that were buried up there. And there were, they would say cause of death, and sometimes a baby would be, would be a day old, sometimes be a year old, but there were just so many babies, and a lot of them just didn't have names. They'll just say Baby Campbell or whatever, but there's quite a few babies that are buried up there, and that's just heartbreaking. Is you see what they died of, and you realize that today they would have lived, but back then they just couldn't do anything for them. No, no, no. There may have been, I know at least one stone that I know is a baby up there, but the rest of them no. Mm. Well, I just don't want people to. Well, after working with that cemetery, I started uh, working, uh, looking at other cemeteries where my family were buried, like in West Virginia and places like that, and we just tend to, as a community, we just don't take care of our cemeteries, and just like we just forget, and and it just breaks your heart to go see where you have relatives that are there, but you just have to chop through hedges and weeds and stuff to get to them. And I understand they're not there anymore, but at least respect them. And that's the one thing I hope will come from some of this, is that people will take better care of the cemeteries and make sure that the stones are kept looking good, and because it's just it's awful when you, because in West Virginia, I know I went up there, and I was just so hurt. There was a mountain, and one cemetery on one side of the mountain, one cemetery. It's just split. It was a Italian cemetery here and a black cemetery there. The Italian cemetery was immaculate. The black cemetery was just in awful shape, and that just it broke my heart. And but since then, some of the veterans up there have decided they're going to clean. They started cleaning it up, and now it looks just as good as the other side. But really, you can't really blame the community that much because a lot of the black folks moved, and they just took off out of when the mining started going down, they just took off. So the black community just shrunk, and so there really wasn't anybody there taking care of it. But it's still heart wrenching to see. At one time, it was the largest black community in West Virginia, and now I think I read where it's the smallest populated county in West Virginia now, because it's just they even though they lost a Walmart, so you know it's bad if they lose a Walmart. Yeah, they some of them stayed, and but their children usually left. One of my cousins, I just mentioned him before. They fought in Africa. He went up there, but as soon as the war came, he got out. He said, "That's the only thing good about the war. It got me out of the mines," and then he moved on to Indianapolis. And that's what a lot of people did after they got out of the war. They moved on someplace else. Well, my mother came from kind of an odd family. She had half brothers. She had a lot of half brothers, and her mother had been married before, and so she was so much younger than all the rest of the people. She and her brother, her full brother, were a lot younger than her family. So they ended up going other places and moving out of the house. So it left her with her dad. Her mom had died during childbirth, and it left her with her father, because her younger brother had back in those days. Uh, some white families could they they would take a young black kid in and basically raise them, and they would do work. And so my uncle would stay with this family in Abingdon, and he did work for them and basically stayed with them. They cared for him, and so she was left with her father, and so there was no work. This was probably the 1920s, and there was no work there in Abingdon, so they moved to Bristol, and he was a stonemason. He came here in Bristol, and she and my grandfather lived right on the street, McDowell Street, in several different houses, because people would rented out their rooms back in those days, and so they stayed here, and he remarried. Until integration. Went to up to fifth grade, and then went to sixth grade in the white schools. I started sixth grade in Fairmount Elementary School.
How was that?
Mm. It was really different. It was really different. It well, it's I don't know how to explain it. I never had any problems as far as a couple of problems, at first, but not anything big. But it's just you just feel kind of lost because you're so. It was such a community here at Slater. We were all so close, and even you would be close to the junior high kids and the high school kids, and we'd have plays together, and so everybody knew each other, and it was just such a family. And then to go over there, you just felt lost. You didn't know anybody, and it was kind of lonely. No, I lived that's about half a mile that way where I live now. Uh, and yeah, we'd walk to school every day. I graduated with a degree in broadcasting, of all things, yeah. And then I found out how much money they made. And I just, zoop. That's when I worked in Bristol at Eastman for about a year and a half, and then I knew that wasn't for me. I decided to move to Texas. At that time, Houston was booming, and I just set out for Houston. Didn't know anybody there, but I just went out there and got in the oil industry. Yeah, well, I I enjoyed out there for a little while, but Texas wasn't the place for me. No. Well, my mother, I had taken her down there to live with me for a while, a year. She had retired, and she came to live with me for a year, and she just did not care for it at all. So she decided to come back, and so after I had been married and we were getting divorced, and I decided to move back up here with her because at that time she was getting older, and I didn't want her to be here by herself. So I came back. It's changed for the better in that when in the earlier days, when they went through the process of urban renewal, that was a really bad bad part of living here for black people because they basically just, as they did in most communities, just decided they were going to build roads and stuff right through the black community and move them where they wanted to go or not. And so that, and that's what they did. They just moved them out of their houses and neighborhoods that they'd been living in all their lives and moved them to another part of town. Well, you'd be talking about over around Vance Junior High and down where it's a street called Woodlawn used to be over there in that area. It would be the street, what is the name of that street that's going right down the side of Tennessee High over in there. But, well, Edgemont, and what's the street on the other side of Tennessee High? Uh, I can't, I can't think of it right now. But anyway, over in that area where, mm, no, no. Um, they just took the whole in College Avenue over in that area. They just took all those black people out of there, and well, there were some white people, some white families there, but mostly black people, and moved them to other was. And I know most people know one area of Bristol, Springdale. It was basically a dump, and they built a subdivision on top of this dump, and that's where they put us. This one, not me, but that's where they put. So that lets you know what they thought about us back then. And yeah, that's basically the way it was. And I'd, uh, I remember I told a couple of people this story. I can't remember the guy's name. You remember Larry Carter? Larry Carter. He used to be over the housing here in Bristol, Tennessee, and I remember having when I was a little kid, they were had announced that they were going to put public housing in our neighborhood where I live, Lily Street, Delaney Street. They were going to take all those houses away and put in public housing, and we decided we were going to have a meeting. Well, not me, but the adults decided they were going to have a meeting with the city, and they wanted somebody from the city to come in and talk to them. They were going to explain to them why they shouldn't do it. And I remember Lorenzo Wyatt and Mr. I can't think of his name. A couple of influential black people were at the meeting, and Larry Carter came. He was there, and you could tell. I just remember this, and he was frustrated. He didn't want to be there, and there were people getting up talking about why they shouldn't do it. Well, he gets up and says, "I just remember." He was just so nasty. He just said, "Well, I'll tell you what. We're gonna get this property if we want it. It all depends on whether we want it or not, and that's that." And he just walks out. He just basically saying, "This meeting's all for nothing. We're going to get it if we want it." And then, but for some reason, it never happened. Then I don't know if that meeting had anything to do with it or he just decided against it. But so that's the way, kind of the way we felt about urban renewal back then, because it got kind of nasty sometimes.